this is an exploration of practice-led research as it appears in my life and the way early recordings tie in with the way I study written sources. So it's taken me a while, and I'm still in the process of getting my head around the relationship between practice-led research and research-led practice. And for me, this drawing of the hands is a good representation of it, because I have trouble separating them. In fact, if I play something, I'm drawing on all kinds of knowledge, including things I've read in books, but also more intuitive knowledge that I've picked up from colleagues. And then there's that physical knowledge of playing something on your instrument that can be hard to articulate. That feeds into the questions I ask the sources when I want to learn more. And I go back to the sources, and they tell me something that changes everything, that blows my mind in some way or other. It takes a while to absorb that into my own playing, and the tensions I discover there then get me asking different questions that I take back to the other sources. And for me, in that, in the context of that process, recordings are a kind of shock treatment. So I'll hear an early recording and I'll think, reality is not what I thought it was. I have a completely new set of questions to take back to written sources. So my first experience with this was hearing this cellist and actor, August von Biene, play the Broken Melody on a compilation of early cello recordings that came out quite some time ago now. I heard it in my 20s, and I just thought it was hilarious. How do I play? I'm not seeing my cursor. There it is. Just click. No, go back. I'm sorry, guys. Oh, it's showing up on, I can see it on that screen. But it's not. To the speaker, this is going to be a lot more interesting. You're hearing it coming out of. Okay, good. So I'll just give you a quick snapshot of how that affected my playing when I first heard this in my mid-20s. All I could hear were these crazy exaggerated slides, and I think a lot of people who aren't used to early recordings, this, especially if they play the cello, this is what leaps out to them. That sort of thing. Okay, thank you. So, in the privacy of my own home, I'd sit down and I'd play that and I'd laugh. And then I listened back to the recording, and it didn't sound like that at all. Can hear you. Okay, so what I'd first heard as a crazy sliding effect turned out to be a lot more subtle. They weren't all the same slide, and it was clearly some kind of language, not simply an added-on thing to the language. So I got really curious about this, and the first thing I wanted to do was listen to a singer. Oh, no. So I started listening to recordings of Adelina Patti, and this is one where she's singing Gounod's Ave Maria, and there's a violinist playing with her, so you can hear the connection between this sliding playing on a string instrument and sliding playing when a singer's doing it. Yeah, Chris. Can you hear? Very quiet. Get loud. It's too slow.
Turn the volume up.
It's up maximum on my computer.
It's not that that one isn't going through the speakers.
I don't think it's going through the speakers at all.
The other one did, yeah.
The other one did. Yeah, I think he presses spacebar at all. While he's doing that, I'll show a little bit of what I mean by they're not all the same slide. So I'd heard something very gushy, completely uniform and uniformly loud from beginning to end. But sometimes it almost seemed like a different kinds of grace notes with skin grown over them. Sometimes it hugs the notes just below the G, as opposed to that sort of thing, where you could almost write them all out as grace notes. And Kai Kopp, in his work on portamento, has done exactly that. He links them to vocal ornaments, and it's even possible that this is somewhere in their history. This was an early experiment I did with understanding portamento, but as we'll see in a second, I'm in a different direction with it. You know this part really well. Gives you enough of an idea. I know this is such a famous recording that I won't dwell on it. And anyone watching on YouTube who wants to hear the whole thing, these are all searchable in different levels of digital transfer quality. But I do recommend listening to Patti if you haven't. So you can hear that she's sliding in a way we're also not used to. That's also clearly some kind of language. And the violin is imitating not her exact slides, but translating them into violin technique in a way that must be intended to sound vocal. So what's going on? I found Roger Freitas' work on Adelina Patti, and he mentioned that through a seminar paper written for him by a singer called Quinn Patrick Ancrum, he learned about 19th century elocution manuals who were extremely specific about how to slide between speaking pitches. So her seminar paper for him, I got in touch with her and she sent it to me, which is really kind of her. She wrote out one of Patti's arias using this special notation from George Raymond's elocution manual from around 1880. This edition is from 1883, and I'll just go through these really quickly because I've talked about them in more detail elsewhere. So major and minor seconds, the final inflection of a clause or sentence rising or falling through the interval of only a semitone, minor second, chiefly plaintive, and expresses melancholy, dejection, and subdued grief or pathos. He's speaking, right? If the falling inflection descends through the interval of a tone or a musical second, it conveys simply the logical completion of the meaning of a clause or sentence, but without any passion or feeling being expressed. So part of the language is they're not all equally expressive of emotion. That I found interesting. And then rising, it means something different again. The interval of a tone, logical meaning is in progress of development, but again conveys no emotion. But with rising or falling minor seconds, you have something much more emotional going on. Rising and falling minor thirds. If the rising inflection is carried through the interval of a tone and a half or a music of minor third, the inflection becomes strongly plaintive and characterizes all pathetic appeals, whilst if the inflection falls to the same extent, it marks all assertions with an air of grief and lamentation. If the voice rises through the interval of two tones or a major third, it expresses strongly doubt, appeal, and inquiry, and if it falls in the same degree, it conveys strong assertion. When the voice rises through the greater intervals of a musical fifth, or still more, the interval in octave, that wasn't quite an octave, sorry, it expresses earnest appeal, wonder, amazement, and exclamation, while if it falls through the intervals, it expresses the strongest conviction, command, reprehension, hate, and all the sterner passions. Down! Right. So I looked at a bunch of other elocution manuals to see if I could trace where this came from and what it might mean. So here's 80 years earlier. This is John Walker. And as you can see, the inflection is spread out over a clause or a phrase. So we're not talking about a slide on a specific word. It's actually closer to the way I think linguists today think of intonation in English now, where I'm not choosing a word to slide on. If I'm saying something, it goes up and it goes down and it goes up and it goes down. And the ups and downs are guided by my points of emphasis. But there's no kind of exaggerated slide I'm doing. I'm basically sliding all the time. And this can be traced back even earlier than that. There's an amazing document by a musician called Joshua Steele in the mid-18th century where he zooms into the microtonal level because he wants to prove in the linguistic circles, he wants to prove that we're always sliding when we talk. They hadn't noticed this because officially English just has a stress accent, not a pitch accent like ancient Greek or modern Chinese, well, probably ancient Chinese too. But something happens in the 19th century. Here is something from the middle of the century, Weaver, and he's got this semi-musical notation for writing it. And as you can see, the long teardrops, it's a 4-line stave, so it's not exact, but you can see that he's going seems, he slides more of that, madam, tiny little slides, nay, bigger slide, it is, I, no, not, seems. So the vanishing point is the sharp end of the teardrop. And then by the time you get to Raymond later in the century, it seems to be so codified that you could almost line up every single interval with a meaning. Not all of them yet. Unfortunately, he doesn't cover fourths because the general axes that he's working with are major versus minor, big versus small, and up versus down. So a fourth is nothing in particular. And as a cellist, that was really frustrating to me because early recordings and 19th century editions slide all the time on perfect fourth, so it must mean something. So based on that, I developed, I don't know if I'd resurrected the language or not, or if I'd made myself a Creole, but I started thinking of each interval as having its own expressive meaning, and I could get something like that meaning by listening to the sound of my own speaking voice. So actually, I should have put this in the presentation. I'll play it to you on my computer afterwards, but in the middle of the process, I got together with Inya and did a cover of this Van Vina recording, thinking of the slides in those terms. But then something else happened to me. This is the next feedback loop of research and practice. I heard a recording of Van Vina actually doing some of the one-man show that this melody is famous for. So you can hear him talking. Now, based on the elocution manuals, I had the idea that they must have gone from the kind of sliding I'm doing right now to an exaggerated glide, because I could hear that in my ear. So I thought that must have been what was happening. And I expected something really slidey. And instead, come here. Cat and mouse. Hi. Why is it so loud?
Victory, victory. This is the contract time. Bonjour, I have accepted my opera. And I come to congratulate me. I have won 6 at last. When Bonjour heard my melody.
I'm sorry, this is painfully loud. Yeah, I can't control it from my computer anymore.
Just up here, so if you tap the screen.
Oh, that screen.
And then it's
Sorry,
just volume
I got it
level.
now.
It'll
Good.
Go down a little bit more.
Yeah.
Play it.
All right. Go back to the beginning. All right.
Victory, victory. This is the contract time. Bonjour, I have accepted my opera. And I come to congratulate me. I have won 6 at last. When Bonjour heard my melody. Come, come and sing me the melody we both love so well. highlighting
He's found a note, right?
farewell forever. Oh, this must be some joke. Farewell forever. Table, not there. General Divino, I don't understand. That picture, God, Almighty God, it is true that she has left me. My God, and this is the hour of my triumph.
Okay, so there were a few types of speech going on in there, right? He comes back from some professional triumph to find his wife has left him. So at first, there's no sliding. Like, victory, victory. Something like that. Absolutely nothing. And then when he says, Mabel, come, then you start to have a bit of a slide. Sing with me the melody. Now we've got something more like his playing. But he's about to play, so there's a transition from the speaking into the playing. Then he plays the melody that we've already heard, breaks off. He's found a note. It's definitely her writing, and it says farewell forever. And at that point, he's not sliding anymore. He's shocked, right? And the farewell forever, that's a bit of a slide again. Farewell forever. Farewell forever. Tiny bit, not as much as I would have expected. And then once he realizes that she's left him, then you really get the slides that I was expecting the whole time, with vibrato, right? The hour of my trial, you know, this sort of thing that you almost don't even hear in string playing until later on in the early 20th century. But barely would you slide and vibrate exactly at the same time. So that surprised me a bit that there wasn't more sliding, and I thought, well, maybe he's an outlier. You know, he's not a native English speaker. He's a Dutch speaker. He's when he exclaims "Allmächtiger Gott," that's not even Dutch. That's German. So maybe he's playing a German character and no. Why does he Polish? But that's not Polish. Okay. Mein Gott, does he pretend he thinks that's Polish? All right, I speak under correction in all matters. From...
As long as the London audience thought it was Polish, it's fine.
I'll speak under correction because there are people here who know more about the show itself than I do. But my point is, I thought maybe he's an outlier. Maybe this is not how English speech goes. Fortunately, Patti is an English speaker. She grew up in New York. And we have her speaking. So what does she sound like?
God bless you, my dear husband, born in the year 1908. This is a message which I want you to keep for all time, so that you may have my voice ever visit your loving Adelina, otherwise Patti.
That's even less slidey. It's less slidey than I would talk. God bless you, my dear husband, right? I guess she's doing it like a speech. I went on the British Library Sound Archive after this, and I listened to speeches, and they often sounded a bit like that. And I'd often thought, maybe that's the decline of declamation. They're not doing any inflections. I'm a Baroque cellist in my other life, and we have really strong opinions on what rhetoric sounds like. And this wasn't it. So I found the earliest sampling I could find of spoken word recordings And I'm hoping this link works because I couldn't figure out how to embed it.
From Childe Harold's Pilgrimage by Lord Byron. Clear, placid Leman, thy contrasted lake, with the wild world I dwelt in, is a thing which warns me with its stillness to forsake earth's troubled waters for a purer spring. This quiet sail is as a noiseless wing to waft me from distraction. What?
Wings to waft me from distraction. He's almost holding a pitch so steady that he could be singing. Now, okay, so he's a famous actor. This is Kenneth Barnes. He's definitely an English speaker. This is definitely how it's supposed to go. Is he maybe speaking up for the horn? Let's hear some prose.
Roger de Cavallet at Home by Joseph Addison. Having often received an invitation from my friend Sir Roger de Cavallet to pass away a month with him in the country, I last week accompanied him thither and am settled with him for some time at his country house, where I intend to form several of my ensuing speculations. Sir Roger, who is very well acquainted with my humor, lets me rise and go to bed when I please.
Well, the slides are there. They're there much more in prose than they are in poetry. Me rise and go to bed when I please. That was what I was expecting to find across the board. So I feel like I'm just scratching the surface here, but I went back through the elocution manuals I'd already looked at, and this time I wasn't looking for evidence of slides. I was looking for evidence of not inflecting pitch, because naturally we inflect pitch everywhere. I started to wonder if I was looking at the wrong aspect of inflection versus uninflection, and I've put up this famous optical illusion of the two faces versus the vase or vase. Here, it's easier than usual because it's black on white and it's a white background to see the vase first. And yet, as humans, we're just so conditioned to see faces that even now, you might find yourself looking at the two faces instead. And I started to wonder if my relationship to portamento had something to do with this, that I was hearing the slides as the effect, when in fact, the most declamatory aspect of the effect was the absence of the slides, and the slides were a kind of concession to nature. They were what made it sound plausible. So we go back to Weaver and his teardrops. Here's a classic example of the solemn monotone, and I found this in many of the manuals, and they always use this passage, which is from Paradise Lost. It's the part where Satan has now started to bounce back from his defeat, and he's set himself up as a rival god, and it's absolutely splendid to see his throne, and yet utterly evil. So you have a sense of horror, but also awe and unwilling admiration that Milton's set up. And this effect appears to be perfectly suited, at least as the 19th century goes on, for the solemn monotone. So we've got high on a throne of royal state, which far outshone the wealth of Ormus and of Ind. So even there, it doesn't slide down; it just jumps down, and you have these plateaus that can be lower or higher to slightly mimic the rising and falling of ordinary speech, but it's a kind of ritual speech. You're almost intoning it. And I thought, well, how far back does that go, and what's that made of? Here I consulted Joshua Steele. I'm not talking about Steele nearly as much as I would like to, because he really stole the show in my own mind. But Jed Wentz did a wonderful presentation on this source in general, and so people watching on YouTube can actually click right over to it if you search for Joshua Steele, Prosodia Rationalis. But here he's not writing a declamation manual. Those didn't exist yet, as far as I know. He's just rebutting linguists' claim that we don't slide when we talk. So here is his example of one thing our speech is not. But if this essay be not sufficient to prove that what the melody of speech is, let us in the next place endeavor to show what it is not. It is not like the proclamation of a parish clerk announcing the psalm. Let us sing to the praise and glory of God, where the whole sentence is in one tone without any use of acute or grave. So for him, there would be no occasion for actually talking like this. And he, just below the part that I've clipped for you, he gives an example of what poetry would sound like if you did that. And he's expecting you to find it as ridiculous as he does. From the same period, we've got Thomas Sheridan in his book on why we should be teaching elocution in schools, and it would solve a lot of the world's problems. Here he's talking about in church, the way certain Bible verses, no, all Bible verses tend to be intoned rather than spoken in a way that clarifies their meaning. So the context of this is he's just gone through what's since become kind of a trope of showing how emphasis changes meaning. He says, shall you ride to town tomorrow? Shall you ride to town tomorrow? And he explains the difference and all that. And then he gives this Bible verse as it is often spoken in church. And he says this is very bad. If we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in, and the truth is not in us. But if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Now, I'm making up the tones here because he's not talking about tones. He's talking about emphasis. He would say that you have to think about which word actually makes the meaning pop out and emphasize that word. But what's happening here is, apart from the word say, it's the end of a line. It's always the end of a line, or the end of a clause. So you can really imagine that it might be the beginning of a church monotone, maybe linked to the plain chantish thing from the previous slide, maybe not. If we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves. Maybe that's where your high on the throne comes from. The earliest I could find for poetic solemnity as opposed to church solemnity comes from John Walker, and this is an elocution manual. He says, the more colloquial and familiar the language, provided it is earnest and emphatical, the more perceptible the inflections are, and the more elevated and poetical, the less so. He goes on to quote the High on a Throne passage, and he says, apart from two words, I think pearl and gold, you can do the entire thing in a monotone. So whether he's to be taken absolutely literally or he's either a lesser or more extreme version than what I showed you in the Weaver. That might be what the declamation we can hear about in early 20th century recordings is coming from. Maybe it's church solemnity translated into poetical solemnity, translated into art, which means what I had been trained as a Baroque cellist to think of as rhetoric versus romanticism or modernism or singing lines might be something more like declamation versus conversation. So this quote had been confusing me for a long time. This is Fanny Davies talking about the way Brahms played the beautiful C major andante from the C minor trio. He gave out the melodic line very beautifully with the thumb or little finger, not declaiming it, but putting it very clearly and elegantly. So it could be that when Brahms writes things with inflection or plays things with inflection, it's more the way he would talk to a friend, not the way you would talk to a crowd. Oops, that's the end. Sorry, I thought I had a thank you slide. Anyway, thank you very much. This is, I feel like I've got more questions than answers at this point, but what I want to leave you with is the idea that possibly what makes something declamatory, at least at the turn of the last century, is exactly the opposite of what in early music we tend to think of as rhetorical. So I could show you my cover of the Funbina now, but I think even now I would play it differently. Oh, wait, here it is. Why? Thinking. Never mind, we're over time anyway. Okay, you can stop now. I'll turn the sound off. It won't trouble us. But basically, maybe his slides are his concessions to nature. So the part where he's speaking, that's the declamatory part. That's intimacy. That sort of thing. And it could be that, say, the slow movement of the Rachmaninoff cello sonata. The monotone is the rhetorical part. And this for me would change a lot and might be worth a radical consideration of what speaking sounded like in the 18th century as well, because Steele shows the difference between an ordinary sentence, Hamlet soliloquy, the to be or not to be speech, which is meant to project and yet to sound intimate, and then the opening of Paradise Lost. So you can really construct a lot about how people spoke in public in the very period when rhetorical thinking seemed to shape music. Any questions?
So I had a question or comment. I was really fascinated by how well Jed Wentz and your presentation complemented each other, because what Jed Wentz said about the rise of education, obviously language is a very important part of it, and in a way the birth of national language is also like a 19th century thing. So you've got in places like Germany or Italy, actually the language actually kind of appears as national language for the first time, but even in the English-speaking land or in Spanish-speaking lands, there's this concern with, this is what it means to talk properly. And we're going to teach you, how to do it, obviously at the level of grammar, but also at the level of intonation, pronunciation, and so on. And yeah, I suppose at the moment it's more a comment or an observation rather than a question. And I wonder if this is maybe something we should look more at, look more at the connections between these.
Yes.
Really focus on language and the performing styles in the late 19th century. Yeah,
it's something as I was doing the research for this presentation, I thought, oh my goodness, I need to spend 10 years working on this. This could be the next thing that I completely lose myself in, because even the written sources alone are an almost completely untapped resource. And then now that we have so many recordings available to us, different languages and dialects, different social classes, but also different occasions, and those all have a different intonation baked into them. Add that to classical music, which, I was actually unaware that the style, until Jeroen's presentation, that the style of a certain instrument in a certain town could be so insulated at that late date. I tend to think of that as something we have to watch out for with earlier music, but then I imagine it all becoming international in this period, so that also changes my thinking. But my thoughts so far have been, just as in British English, there's a received pronunciation that everyone can pick up if you have a posh enough social setting, you go to the right schools, you have the right friends, and you start to talk in a certain way. Maybe there's something equivalent to that in playing. There's a received pronunciation of musical declamation. Maybe that's more closely linked to German or Austrian ways of speaking. I think especially with Austria, there's a fantastic paper written, I think in the 70s, about the links between Strauss's writing and the way the Viennese actually talked. And I think, especially when I hear Europeans
play American music, I think, oh no, they need to talk more like me. I hadn't realized that every music has this native soil of language, and it can be very specific, but then once it's been translated into music, it can suddenly get international. So maybe the cantilena style is us speaking Italian in our instruments and not our native language. And maybe if we play then in another style, we're speaking a language closer to our own. I don't know.
I mean, there's so much of a trend for metaphors for music which are about language. So if music is either a universal language or simply language, and also the idea of singing with your instrument, which is something we find like so adventurous a lot with those kinds of metaphors.
And in German melodrama too, the line between singing and speaking is so blurred that you can even hear the speaker matching the pitch of the instruments playing behind them. And there's less of that than I expected in the Von Biene, so I don't know if English melodrama would have the same effect going or not. George?
Well, actually, certainly in the late 19th century, it was very popular for people to recite poetry with a piano accompaniment. Well, nearly finished a piece of work on this, not today, but there are surviving examples of composers writing piano accompaniments for recitation, and you just get the words. That's all you get. It's based out of the piano. Sometimes there was also Granville Bantock did two of those when he was a student in 1892.
I'd love to hear those. Are they recorded?
No, no one's ever recorded. There is one piece by Bax, which is awesomely difficult. It's a huge piano part, like a Wagnerian opera or a post-Wagnerian opera, just everywhere. And somewhere you have to recite a poem by Dante Rossetti over it. And there's so little correspondence within the music and the meaning of the words that it's like there's two separate dramas going on at the same time.
Wow.
It's extraordinary. I don't want to take up too much time. I've always had a theory, I've lived without I've been there for some years, but I've always had a theory which I've never done any work on, and I have no idea if it's right or not, that his acting style in that wonderful recording is based on Yiddish theatre in London at the time.
You've mentioned that.
I have no idea how to research that. I don't know what you do, but it's just a notion which I did a radio program about that some years ago, and in the course of that, one of the people in that program made a casual suggestion. It sounds like Yiddish theatre to me, and I thought, oh, crikey, I'm not going there. I'd be so wasting my time. But
do you at least know if he was a Yiddish speaker? I know he was Jewish.
He was Sephardic. I don't think he was a Yiddish speaker.
No.
The only references to his speaking style in the British press, they think it's great that he has this is awful. They think it's great that he has a Dutch accent because the first role he took on stage was Rip Van Winkle. And they thought his acting was pretty terrible, but at least he had the right voice.
You got to start somewhere.
Which is, but yeah, and of course that recording when he's playing, that's the middle of the three recordings he made that piece, and you can tell he's just adapted his. He's got no time to practice anymore at this point. He's just touring all the time, and you can tell he's just conserving his energies. He's still got excellent technique. He's not out of tune or anything. And he's just taking his time. He's not going to hurry any of these shifts, and the orchestra's just going to have to, hang around all the pianist. He foxes his pianist at one point. The pianist comes in a note early at one of those portamento, and he says, nope, I'm not arrived yet. They're fascinating recordings. But I think, the Yiddish theatre is an area that might look at it.
Yeah, I suppose we'd have to compare it to English language melodrama and also the German ones.
Yeah,
just
exactly.
To see if there are these different national schools of semi-musical declamation.
I don't know if there's an early recording of the Strauss melodrama. Enoch Carter. He wrote a piano accompaniment to accompany someone reading tennis.
There's a great one I was listening to of Hexenlied, and he he really matches the pitch of the orchestra at various points, because he was a tenor as well as a famous actor. So he was perfectly trained to blur the line between singing and speaking, and he frequently does. It sounds a bit like it's as though Sprechstimme is, it already exists, and all Schoenberg had to do was cut the cord between something and something. And even Matthias Nöther's book about late 19th century German declamation makes it sound as though the quasi-singing qualities of declamation are part of a general aestheticization of speech and therefore politics. And maybe people have been a little bit reticent to research it, because in German that was headed to a very dark place. But yeah, we could rewind the clock. We could learn a lot about music. Yes?
I was thinking when you mentioned our previously pronunciation, it has implications not just for tone and intonation, but rhythm as well. Is that very clipped rhythm you get specifically particularly with your pronunciation, probably in other pronunciation styles in other language at that time as well, perhaps. And there's definitely a correlation with that and the playing style of British musicians at the time. And it even came up, one online commentator who shall remain nameless was referring to the recording of the Rachmaninoff Second Piano Concerto on Brief Encounter, and how much like the clipped RP style of the actors this performance was. And he was saying that this was a terrible thing, it's this dreadful brusque, and I've never seen someone so close to getting the point and doing it so spectacularly. But it was interesting, it's so clearly audible that it comes up in a sort of colloquial context. But the phrasing style, that kind of the clipped endings and the rushed rhythms and those things are very much like that pronunciation style.
Absolutely. And I think also Austrian, and maybe particularly a posh Viennese accent compared to, say, a North German accent. It also, like, the double consonants hold you back more. You say bitte, not bitte. Yes.
So if you can take this the last question, because we are coming back to
we're way over. Sorry.
So
Yes.
Two things. First, I think there are big differences in national style of declamation. There are a few Sarah Bernard recordings on YouTube, and she has lots of vibrato, and it does lots of. She jumps a lot in her declamation. It's nothing stable or on one pitch.
That's right.
It's quite striking. And what you were saying about perhaps portamento drops off of declamation in early in the century, the recordings you were playing, and then you play Patti. Patti's style was very oldish at that point, and the new generation of singers were 1870s, 1880s, wouldn't do all that portamento in the same years. So this is the 1903 recording of Patti. You can compare with 1902 recordings of Caruso or Carelli, and they wouldn't sing all that portamento. And Patti does a lot of from below the attack, and that was gone at that time when she was more or less. So maybe that confirms what you were thinking about the disappearance of portamento in declamation, and goes on the same in parallel with singing. What's happening?
This is something I'm wondering about. That maybe what I've thought of as the abandonment of declamation is a continuation of declamation, and declamation itself changed to something more sostenuto to show how different it was from being casual or sentimental or intimate, and maybe why the lowbrow arts continued to get slidey, and in fact got even slider. If you think of Frank Sinatra compared to classical musicians in the 1950s, you could see the split. And I think John Powder's work on portamento even points that out, that the same singer in a highbrow versus lowbrow context does different amounts of portamento. So, yeah, I agree.